Well, good morning, Rob.
Morning.
It's good to see you. Thank you for meeting like this.
No problem at all. Glad to be here.
So we're gonna meet because we're gonna talk about this book, little book on U.S. armor in the Pacific.
Yes.
So, just before we start, I'm speaking to you. You tell me where you're speaking from. And
Sure. Well, due to the current environment, of course, I'm speaking from home right now. Um, we're on a little bit of a restricted status at work, but I'm speaking from my own personal library. And but of course, I'm from Fort Benning, Georgia, and that's where I am the curator of the Armor and Cavalry collection for the U.S. Army. So essentially, the Armor Museum for the U.S. Army.
yeah,
I've been curator now for about a little over 2 years now, but prior to that, I was an armor officer on active duty for just under 10 years. Came in 2008, served as a tank platoon leader, a scout platoon leader, both with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq, and then served as a Stryker Company Infantry XO. Moved on to my captain's course, was an Armored Cav troop commander actually at the Armor School, helping to train lieutenants, and then went out, was an operations officer, and then a battalion executive officer at Fort Riley, Kansas.
fantastic bio. So we both served on M1 Abrams, right?
Yes.
Armored Cap. So we should have an episode about that in just to.
Oh, I do love the Abrams.
Yeah, me too. So we'll have to organize that sometime. So can you just give us an update on the museum?
Sure. So as far as the actual public museum, the money's still being raised for that by the National Armor and Cavalry Foundation. The big change we have going on with our side of the house, the Army side of the house, not the Foundation side of the house, is that we have a brand new building that is almost complete. Officially, it is called the Armor and Cavalry Heritage Training Support Facility. What that means is that the building is funded by the U.S. Army for the training of soldiers. The Army actually has this new initiative where every soldier coming through, whether it's basic training, officer training, their NCO courses, non-commissioned officer courses for the sergeants, they all are to, with their other classes, do at least 2 hours at a minimum of history training. That's both 2 hours of basic Army history and also their branch history. So with the privates, we bring them through. We teach them about the early cavalry history, the armor branch history, the origins of that, all the way up to today. We do go into technology as well, and that's where the tanks really come to use for us. So the building that we have is being funded for that. It's 100,000 square feet. We template between 220 and 250 vehicles. Well, I shouldn't say just vehicles, but tanks, tank destroyers, armored personnel carriers, anti-tank guns, at least one helicopter will all be on display in there for that. But the nice thing is we've already been given the go-ahead, the initial go-ahead. Once we have everything inside, that we'll be able to do public event days, an open house, if you will, where the public can actually come in and view the collection. So I'm really looking forward to being able to share it with the public till the full public accessible museum is complete.
I can't wait. And if I may say so, and this is no reflection on you, it's long overdue, right? So
Yes. No, I mean, like you're saying, it's long overdue. A lot of the collection we have are pieces that were Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The Fort Knox pieces were taken fairly well care of. That's actually only about a third of what we'll have on display. A lot of the pieces are Aberdeen Proving Ground pieces that in some cases spent close to 100 years outside. They're not going to look pretty initially, but the best thing we're doing is we're getting them out of the elements, getting them indoors in a climate-controlled facility, and then we can actually get the restoration or preservation work that we need to on them to keep them going, keep them around for the next 100 years or so.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, it's a major change, and I appreciate your service to it.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so appropriately, we're going to talk about U.S. armor. So this is the
yes.
We're going to review now. There's U.S. armor in the Pacific. I'm just going to show it to our audience here. So this is a thin book. It's by Casemate, the publisher. I'm going to show another version, another edition in this series. So I've got two here.
Okay.
This other book here we're not reviewing this one today, but this one is about the Battle of Kursk. And they're about similar size. They focus on a campaign. So this series focuses on a campaign or a battle. So the American armor in the Pacific, it covers the whole Second World War in the Pacific Rim, Asia, U.S. Army, the Marine Corps and the United States Army.
Yes.
It does it in 125 pages, including the bibliography. I mean, for me, this sort of book, it has the feel. So Casemate is expanding its series in a way that reminds me a lot of Osprey. So Osprey
Yes.
campaign series.
And the thing I like with that, I mean, a lot of people getting into this field, initially you may not know what is good material. And first of all, I have to do my normal disclaimer that anything I say is my view only, not the U.S. government's or the U.S. Army's. So that's just the normal disclaimer. Since we're talking about books, I always throw that in there. A lot of people initially will dismiss those Osprey books or a book like this, just based on the size or soft cover. Everyone wants the big tomes, like the honey cuts and everything I have back behind me, or some of the Spielberger and Jens books. But the thing I like about those small little books, like you're saying, is they focus on one campaign or one theater or one vehicle. And so as much as we, academics like to think we know, a lot about our field, you of course need either a refresher or maybe you're not familiar with that specific campaign. And so it's great because you can get something like this, like you said, 130 pages in it. And in a day, you can get a pretty good overview of that topic. And that's actually, in my opinion, that's a really good start then for if you're doing research, that this is a good for developing your outline.
Yeah. I mean, we forget more than we
yeah.
know at any point in time. So it's good to have something like this on the shelf to go refer to when
yes.
pressure. But these books, I'm going to show this hard copy. So there's some interesting production choices in this book. So well, one thing I'll show, they've got the binding here. It's a soft cover binding, but it's got these folding extensions here, which are useful for marking inside the book. So that's a nice feature. That's a extra expense for the publisher, which I appreciate. The quality of the paper is great. You've got nice, glossy, heavy paper for such a thin book. There are a lot of photographs here. There are some interesting, what we call call-out options in publishing. So right at the front, there's a timeline. So let's go to a particular page. This is a feature of all the books in this series. So there's a great timeline.
I love that touch because that kind of reinforces, it does have a table of contents, but the fact that the book follows that timeline flow, really know if you're looking for something in particular, you kind of know where it's going to be in the book.
Yeah, this is almost an academic feature. You don't typically see this in history books. But appreciating the timeline. So just to explain what we mean by a timeline. So here is a scale essentially from 1941 through 1945, and different key events are placed on this scale and then called out to text boxes. So these are call out boxes explaining key events for the US war in the Pacific. And that's a great reference, very useful. It's a bit burdensome for the publisher to do, and it's great when they do it.
Like I said, it's a nice little touch, and I like the fact that it's not just the armor developments, but without going too overboard, giving you an overview of what's going on in the war as these developments are taking place.
Yeah. It's not even a timeline of tanks or tank development or anything or doctrine. It's just a timeline.
It's operations. Yep.
Yeah, so it's a good foundation for the rest of the book. There are a number of call-outs. So again, this is sort of an academic feature. You see this in textbooks a lot. So text is sometimes called out in a separate separate box where there's something nice to know or something to highlight separate to the main flow of the text. Lots of photographs, and there are some color images too. So page 56 is a good example.
So anyone following along, I'm actually looking on a digital version, and I'll tell you the photo quality is actually really good on the digital version as well.
I think they print well too.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it looks good. So production values are high, I think. I think that's the best summary of what we're looking at. Now, what about the content? What did you think of the content?
So content-wise, initially one thing I really like is that in the beginning, after the timeline, the author has an introduction to kind of build up what's going on. So the first thing he talks about is how the Japanese, not just technological development, but also kind of their doctrinal development a little bit without going into too much detail. Again, I would call it kind of like you're saying academic. This is kind of the 101 level course, where he kind of talks about why the Japanese were in the position they were with armor when the war begins, why they're necessarily not developing 30-ton tanks, why their tanks are in the 15 to 20-ton range, based off experiences in Russia and in China, as well as fitting out their doctrine in the Pacific, as well as their ability to move those vehicles around. And then he goes into the American side from the World War I Tank Corps being disbanded with the 1920 National Defense Authorization Act, and a little bit just very, very basic. And I can say, because that's actually one of my focuses, is kind of the interwar development of tanks and the armored force.
Yeah.
Introduction, kind of how that play out, to kind of say, okay, here's the introduction, here are the players, here's how they get to where they're at, and now the war begins. And so I really like that bit. And then from there, everything is told mainly from major operational standpoint. So linear, which is pretty common in history of books. Content-wise, though, I liked it. The first thing I have to say is any book that does armor in the Pacific already gets props to me, because the Pacific is such a neglected theater when it comes to armor. So props right there already. 50 bonus points. I don't know if there's point system with this, but already bonus.
I agree with you. And to cover both the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps in one book for the whole Pacific, that's good too, because people often don't realize that, well, first of all, the Marine Corps had effective armored divisions, because all their Marine divisions, that they all had tank battalions in them. So they were sort of like light tank divisions.
I think it was actually, in the European theater, we had, U.S. Army had both its armored divisions, which were really designed for breakthrough operations. You have the separate tank battalions, which were designed to support the infantry divisions, but those are task organized battalions. So if one division needs 2 or 3 battalions for a major operation, they're shuffling those battalions around, which especially in the early days of Normandy causes issues, because units can't develop standard operating procedures working together. They can't develop effective techniques at first. And then the Pacific, you have none of those armor divisions, all those separate tank battalions. But the one thing I love is, like you're saying with the Marines, is the Marines have organized that each of their divisions have 1 tank battalion, which until, I guess, next year, the way they're talking, they've always maintained at least 1 tank battalion per division.
That's a tragedy. We should have an episode about that.
Oh, goodness, yes. That's definitely one of those major disclaimer episodes where these are just my personal opinions and has nothing to do with my actual job. But the Marines really, as early as the 1920s, and they do go into, the author does go into the book a little bit in the introduction, but the Marines as early as the mid-1920s are already developing this idea of expeditionary armor. Sure, you're not going to show up with a major armor force capable of conducting deep penetrating attacks, but you can put the combat power immediately on shore until the combat power can be built up. And so I think that's always really important to highlight the Marines' ability to do that, because really World War II is what really brings them into a more modern age. The Marine Corps so relatively small prior to this war, and then seeing how they bring in armor, not just the tanks, but also Amtraks and other armored fighting vehicles into play. That's anytime that can be focused on, because I think that's really important in today's modern operations as well.
Yeah, we should know that in academic circles, the Marine Corps between the World Wars has often been a case study for military innovation.
Yes, the age of Smedley Butler and some of their operations both in China and South America.
Yeah, so the Marine Corps comes out well from this. The U.S. Army not so well.
No.
The U.S. Navy comes out well because of its development of naval aviation. Marine Corps does well because it develops expeditionary doctrine and some of its technologies, its capabilities that carry over well into the Second World War. And you can't say that about any other force. Their interwar developments don't typically carry over well into the Second World War, including British expeditionary capabilities, which had to be all revamped during the Second World War. So the Marine Corps looks well.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So you praise the book for its grounding in the interwar history. Did you see any errors?
There's a few generalizations, especially in the introduction on armor in America in the interwar years. Nothing that's outright glaring. As far, I'm saying as someone who this is my main focus. So that's one thing. A couple things I would have liked with the content. Case in point, talking about tank units. So you have platoons, companies, battalions. At least for this theater, you don't really have divisions or combat teams or anything like that. But it's not until I think page 44 or so that the author actually has a little box, has one of those box insets to actually say, okay, this is how a American tank battalion was organized, to kind of give you that overview. So it probably could introduce that earlier, maybe with the introduction, kind of overview of how the medium tank battalions that we used at the time were organized. I don't think he does that for the Japanese tank units, which is something I'm not gonna lie, I'm not really very familiar on, is how they organize their tank units as well. So that would have been a nicer touch, I think. To fit in with kind of the tactics and doctrine.
We need a good book in the English language about Japanese.
Yes.
I'm going to agree with you on that. So there was nothing in here really about force structure. So
no.
It would have been simple to draw a tank battalion, a schematic, and we want to know the difference between Marine Corps battalions and U.S. Army battalions too in this period, and we don't. So there is this call-out box on page 43, which briefly describes it's an overview of the tank battalions, but it doesn't really tell you, doesn't go down to the company. It does talk about the light tank company. It doesn't explain how the battalion is organized. I mean, we could have done with a table, actually. Just
your standard order battle. Yeah, I think that would have helped.
Yeah. So I'll agree with you on that. There's nothing on Japanese force structure. So I'll tell you where I was most frustrated on Japanese force structure, when suddenly the Japanese armored division appears in the chronology. Which I mean, I don't. It's difficult for me to imagine what a Japanese armored division looks like because they're so late to.
It is, and I completely agreed. I mean, how manned was this division? What was it supposed to have, and what did it actually have compared to that? How was it trained? Because, of course, studying the Japanese Navy, they're sending some of their best ships filled with essentially conscripts. I would have loved to have known, well, what's the story behind this Japanese armored division? I think there's a missed opportunity. And I know the book is focused on American armor in the Pacific, but speaking especially, much like you, someone who served in an armoring unit, you always look at your operation, it's versus. You can't just say, okay, here's how American armor did in the Pacific without looking at this is what its counterpart was. So I think that's kind of, just to go into that a little bit, I think that's why that view is so important.
Yeah, you describe the book as mostly linear, so it's linear history from start to end, the Pacific campaign. To clarify that, so I think my impression was there are a lot of events. So, this island is invaded, this company landed, the Japanese sent these tanks against it, there was a battle, these are the outcomes, and then let's go to the next island campaign. So it's a series of events, it's a series of confrontations between US armor and Japanese armor. So it's narrative, right? So it's a narrative of battles. It's not really analytical. I wouldn't describe it as analytical. What do you think?
They go a little into some of the lessons learned, but not in depth. It's very general lessons learned.
Yeah,
Infantry and tanks could work better. Well, how could they work better? How did they overcome? Because most of the time, as we know, it's usually a communications issue. So how are they working through that? At the same time, one of the things I do like is that the book does go into very basic descriptions of how, especially Marine tank battalions, were modifying their vehicles against the Japanese anti-tank weapons that were being developed starting in 44. Mines. Yep. And I love those pictures. I love those pictures.
Yeah, wooden armor on the side of a Sherman, and tracks around the turret.
And you see the nails usually are welded on hatches, especially in the Marine tank battalion, to prevent magnetic mines from being put right on top of the hatch. So that's great, and I like that aspect. The only thing is I wish they would have gone more into those actual Japanese weapon systems. They do mention, first of all, in the book, at the beginning of the book, there's actually a nice section where they go over all the armored fighting vehicles the Japanese had at the beginning of the war and throughout the war, which is good. But there's nothing on the anti-tank guns, which actually by the end of the war were the deadliest threat to American tanks, not other Japanese tanks. And that's actually how it was in Europe. Anti-tank guns are more dangerous to the tanks than the actual German tanks. But he doesn't go really any technical specs on how those guns were used, or what does it look like. That would have been great. He references that 47 millimeter gun, the Type 1 47 millimeter, but we never really see any pictures of it. I mean, I know what it looks like because I have one parked in my building, but I would have liked to also see maybe some pictures of what a Japanese magnetic anti-tank mine would have looked like, how the Japanese actually deployed them. Are they using some sort of diversionary tactic while the essentially kamikaze man's running in with it to try to get it on the tank? That would have been a little bit better, because that gives you the challenges of what these tankers were facing. It's not just tank-on-tank fighting. In fact, that's arguably such a little facet of the Pacific armor battle, armor fight. I would have liked a little more detail on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. In a way, because the narrative is built around events where U.S. armor met Japanese armor, in a way it's misleading. So it misleads us away from the typical confrontation is not with Japanese armor.
No. And I will tell you the biggest thing I would have liked to have had in the book, because we're already talking about Pacific armor, so we're already talking about a field that is mostly ignored. I would have liked they would have talked about especially the Marmont-Harrington tanks in the Aleutians campaign. That never gets discussed, is that we actually send armor. A lot of people don't realize is that part of the United States was actually invaded. Granted, it was a territory at the time, not a state, there in Alaska. And we actually sent a small detachment of armor. It's mentioned, I think, in the illustration. There's an illustration of the Marmont-Harrington.
Yeah, so that's there.
But there's actually some amazing pictures, because the crazy thing is a lot of those tanks are still there in the Aleutians, because it just would have been too difficult to get them out of the islands, because they're just in terrible winter conditions. Because, of course, Pacific theater, we don't think of snowy, ice-covered islands with glacier fighting in negative degree temperatures. Everyone thinks of the horrible infested jungles of the Pacific with Japanese snipers in the trees and everything. But the Aleutians campaign, completely different than the rest of the theater. I would have loved to have seen a little bit, just more anything on that. That would have been great, because that is something I know in our own archives we don't have much on. But you see these photos of these tanks being used, and then every couple years an aerial photo will come out where you see these tanks that have just been abandoned on a hillside. Because once we finally cleared the island, it was pretty much just leave all the equipment behind. We're moving on to the next. Moving on to the next.
I tell you what, that's a book you should write, right? There's no book on that.
If I had the time, that's the hard part.
Yeah. So just to clarify, that is the call out box on the Marmont-Harrington. It does mention that, well, to quote, the few vehicles that remained in U.S. service were found mostly in Alaska. But there is no mention of the Aleutian campaign,
and that's an amazing campaign, because a lot of that campaign was, not saying it was hidden from the public, but it just wasn't mentioned because they didn't want people to panic that the Japanese were somehow trying to mount this overland campaign through Alaska. And just horrible fighting conditions that honestly almost approach the Russian Eastern Front winters as far as conditions these units had to fight in. And a lot of that would actually then feed into some of the lessons that were applied with the creation of the 10th Mountain Division and some of our other winter gear, which unfortunately still didn't seem to catch up to us in time with the Battle of the Bulge, but a lot of lessons learned there as far as fighting in mountains and in cold weather.
Yeah. So I'll show another in profile box. So this is a call out box. This is in profile box for the page 28. So Japanese tanks. There's several. I'll make a criticism here. So there's several call out boxes of Japanese tanks without satisfying me, because there's. I mean, there's a whole page here, but there's just not enough specification. So I read a call out box and then I'm like, I still don't know what the gun is, or and
that is always important. I mean, that's especially those of us that read a lot of tank books. That's almost always what you talk about is, what is the vehicle, what's its nationality, but what's its gun? That's always the most important. Main weapon system. I think we still teach that as part of our vehicle identification. You don't just know what the vehicle is, you know what the primary weapon system is, because you need to know if it can kill you or not. Usually frontal armor, so you know if you can kill it, and then usually some sort of mobility capability, whether it's the speed or the range, maybe even horsepower of the engine.
Yeah.
So that would have been even nice just to have that basic information, I think.
Yeah. A table. Would have been another table would have been a good idea.
Oh, agreed. A table for that, and I would have liked to have seen a table that actually listed all the units that were mentioned. I want to know what tank battalions, U.S. Army and Marines, and the Marines are a little more simpler because they're assigned to their division, but what Army tank battalions supported what divisions when. I've seen a lot of that for the European campaign, but you don't see that for the Pacific. And the one reason that's important, because if you're someone researching those tank battalions, a lot of times their after-action reports, their graphics, whatever reports they were doing, went through the division they were assigned to. And so if you're trying to research that tank battalion, you might not find any reference in the National Archives or Army Archives using that battalion's designation. But if you look up the division they were supporting at the time, usually then that's when you find those records.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll just note a production error here. So we were looking at this profile of the Japanese tank. So there's a photograph at the bottom here which shows, it's a useful photograph. It shows the size of the Sherman tank next to a little tankette, or a little tank. It's described here as a Type 94 tankette. So that's on page 28, and then the same photograph appears on page 63. So this is definitely a production error. You should not repeat photographs in the same book unless you go into highlight something new, I suppose. So, and it's the same caption, actually. It is
actually.
Same caption.
It is indeed.
So
Good catch.
That's a bit disturbing. Waste of space. But,
actually, so on the next page, just to go in a little bit more on content, so this would be, on mine, it's page 65. It's probably, I think it's 64 for you. They show an M4 Sherman with the wading trunks. That kind of brought to mind, I would have liked, again, understand it's 130 pages. Yep, that's the picture. 130 pages, so I understand they can't go into a huge amount of detail, but I would have liked to have seen one of those boxes, as you were mentioning, go into detail about how we were transporting our armor and how they were actually getting to the beach, because I think that's a real advantage. One of the things the Japanese realized early on is they're transporting their tanks. If it's on a boat, it's not necessarily going to a built-up harbor, because even if the island it's going to has a harbor, it's probably been bombed either by our own aircraft carriers or their aircraft carriers. So it's either being craned directly onto the beach, or, if it has to, they're putting it on a barge, so they have to be light. Whereas we developed a whole system of landing ship tanks, the wading trunk systems, which actually were developed by Robert J. Ix, the famed armor historian. He was the head of that department. We developed this whole doctrine and technology to support getting even 35-ton tanks from a ship onto the beach, which is just incredible, because up to that time that did not exist anywhere else. Moving tanks on water would have been a huge operation that would have only occurred after the beach was secure. And what we're able to do is tanks are able to go directly into battle from the water.
Yeah.
So would have liked a little more on that.
I mean, this is a book on the Pacific, and most of the armor is landed amphibiously. So
And I think that, I know we were going into detail on the Japanese stuff, and I understand some of that probably with the size of the book, but I think that concept of how are we getting the tanks
yeah,
to and from is a huge, huge.
yeah, I'll show a photograph of page 15. There's a photograph of a Japanese tank that's been made buoyant for amphibious purposes. We could have done with a call-out box just describing the different technologies for making buoyant, for waterproofing, for wading, between the ship and the shore. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'll note.
If you think about it, that's what I mean. Obviously, the armor, the gun is there for fighting, but a tank with its tracks is designed to also fight the terrain and the battlefield. And so that I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of.
That's a good point. I'll just show the maps are great. I'm going to praise the maps. I mean, we're doing a lot of criticism here, but the maps are great. So this is the map to show at this point because it shows the scope of the amphibious problem all the way from. It shows Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the right-hand edge of the map here. That's where the forces were staged from, and then they've got several famous island campaigns to get through: Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and then through the Philippines, and then in plan even Japan, although the atomic bomb foresaw.
And I think that probably would have been a good end cap, is maybe to talk a little bit about probably got the operation name wrong, but Operation Olympic, which is like the overall arching operation to actually invade Japan. Because one of the things we were actually doing was we were actually bringing in more tank destroyers to the Pacific, and even the T-26E3, or what we now know as the M26 Pershing, we were actually starting to stockpile those in Okinawa for an invasion. And so that would have been kind of a neat end cap, I think.
Yeah, interestingly, there are no pictures of the M26.
No, and none of them saw combat in the Pacific, but like I said, they were stockpiling. It was actually the same team that was in charge of introducing the T-26E3 in Europe, Zebra mission. That's why they were pulled from Europe as quickly as possible so they could start prepping the tank also for Okinawa for the eventual invasion. So that would have been nice. And also kind of talking about other vehicles, he has a couple, just a very few, I think it's only like 2 or 3 pictures, and there's only about 4 or 5 mentions. But everything's focused on the tank battalions, and we actually had a couple tank destroyer battalions as well.
That's a good point, yeah. Yeah, M10s were there, right?
M10s, and I believe in Okinawa we even had M18s.
Yeah, so it started with the M3 half-track tank.
Yep, which he actually features. There's a color profile he talks about, which is great because that's a vehicle designed as a tank destroyer, arguably woefully adequate for that role, but loved by infantry being used as a mobile gun platform. Yes, because it's a big 75 millimeter gun. You can pull it up. You got a bunker that's bothering your infantry unit. That comes up, and problem solved.
Yeah, although I mean, better as a defensive weapon than a offensive weapon. We should mention Amtracs too. So there's what we call Amtracs today. So landing vehicle tracked LVTs at the time. So LVT-1. That's on the profile. There is another profile of the Amtracs, that one here. So again, this is a fascinating vehicle, and to the credit of the Marine Corps that they developed this before the Heritage, at least, was developed before the Second World War. And again, it's a peculiar vehicle, so we could have done with some specifications.
Oh, completely agreed. I mean, again, now you're not just using Higgins boats where you're trying to offload the troops. They're not just these Amtracs are not only driving on the beach, but then they're moving inwards. They're providing supporting firepower. They're moving with the troops. They're able to bring in supplies under at least some armor protection. They're able to evacuate casualties. In many cases, that's what they're doing. They're coming in, they're dropping off the troops, they're loading up with the first casualties, they're moving back, and now they're coming back to supplies, grab more casualties, moving back. It really allows that sustained operation because that's one of our issues in Guadalcanal is that we can't keep the supply lines going initially because of all the Japanese aerial attacks. Well, now we have something great because they can just drive not only onto the beach, but then it can drive through the jungles it needs to get its supplies. You don't have to unload everything onto then another track or another truck to get it to a unit. It's going the whole trip one way.
And again, that's where we could have done with a force structure call out.
Yes.
We could appreciate
Yes.
how many units were operating these and where and when they were operating.
Oh, agreed. And how they were using them.
Is there anything else you'd like to highlight here? Any particular photographs that you thought were well chosen? Any production features, call-out features that, I mean, I'm going to praise the maps. Well, while you have a look, I'm going to show another map, which I very much like. So I showed an overview. I showed that overview of the whole Pacific campaign, which is a great map. That map would be great in any history, not just a tank history of the campaign. There's another great map here of Betio Island in the Tarawas. Super map. I mean, these maps are difficult to produce because you've got to get an artist and they've got to be typeset and all that sort of thing. So they are actually a production burden for the publisher. To be fair, the production values, as we said, are high. There's an effort to do quite a few color images, color drawings. There's lots of photographs in this book. That is something we can praise, I think, without caveat. There are a lot of photographs.
Oh, agreed. I just was immensely impressed with the photo quality for the most part. One thing I'll point out is, I look at a lot of photos of Shermans.
Yeah.
To the point that when I open up books, especially European history books and its armor, I can usually almost guess which photos they're going to be, especially because a lot of them have come from either the National Archives, which we have lots of copies of, or they're from our archives in the past. And so I can get bored very quickly. I hate to say a picture. Still enjoy them, but that sometimes will determine if I want to buy a book or not. Especially in the second half of the book, they're just beautiful. I think right now I'm looking at page like 112 and on. There's some beautiful, I mean, just very clear. It's just the clarity of the photos, which isn't just a testament to the photos being selected, but the fact, like you were saying, the production value that, to publish on gloss paper nice photos that focus, that's it costs a little bit, because I've seen books where they republish photos and it just gains some fuzziness as they're republishing it just to try to save money. But probably I would say one of my favorite photos is on page 118 and 119. It's a 2-page spread, I think. And I just love it just because there's a whole lot of vehicles, different types of vehicles. You have earlier M4 Shermans. In fact, I think that's a composite there on the right, which you don't see a lot of those. On the left, there's M4 A3s, and then there's even 75 millimeter or 105 millimeter gun howitzer Shermans.
Yeah, that's true. Great photograph, and to the credit of the publisher that they made it a double-page spread.
Yes, that's one of those that it's really well worth it because there's such a lot of little detail. I just think that's a beautiful picture because it's not a battle picture. So, people want to see pictures of tanks and battles, but in my opinion, especially during this time period, most pictures, unfortunately, during battles are fuzzy. They're not really well focused. Something like this where you can tell this is a unit that's close to the front lines, if not, obviously not directly engaged, and you can see what we're probably looking at is there on the left. That's probably, I would assume, like either a company commander or platoon leader's tank. Everyone's gathered around waiting for orders. You can see that there's 2 radio antenna on there, so there probably is a command tank of some sort. And you can just see, I love seeing all the, some of the tanks still have their waiting trunks they haven't taken off. You can see what sort of equipment they have on board on the back of the vehicle. Mm-hmm. I just love those kind of details. So I'm really glad that one of the things they did was they made that picture a full spread.
Yeah, it's a good choice of photograph. Just note, so the price of this, or back cover price, so this is not the same as Amazon price, but it's $25 essentially, £20, British pounds. So that's the price point you're looking at.
Which isn't bad, like you said, for the quality. I think that's actually, that's about right.
Production values are high. Maps, photographs are great. American Armor in the Pacific from Casemate by Mike Guardia. We should say we don't know Mike Guardia. We have no stake in this.
No.
So, Rob, it's a pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. I look forward to the next opportunity. So thank you. Till the next time.
You got it.
Goodbye.
Bye.